Although the House of Representatives did manage to pass a stimulus bill that would help Americans out, unfortunately, there are some issues in the Senate. So, Senate Republicans have been working with the White House to pass their own version of the next step for stimulus. And they've made it very clear that their top priority is to bail out the very industries who took Donald Trump's tax cuts and bought shares of their own stocks, right? And so there was a lot of talk from Republicans about how, oh, we want to make sure that we help the average American worker out. There's going to be two stimulus checks. No, based on what Republicans wanted, it would be one check and it would only be about $1,200. That's it. And they would also apply means testing to determine who should get it. And believe it or not, the people making the absolute least amount of money would get nearly nothing in help. So let me tell you basically the biggest issue that Democrats had. And let me just be clear, Senate Democrats have blocked what Senate Republicans have wanted. And I think it's a good thing. I think Americans need help. But what this bill was did not include real help to people who are suffering right now. So, a major sticking point, according to the Washington Post, is a $500 billion pool of money for loans and loan guarantees that Republicans want to create, which some Democrats are labeling a slush fund because the Treasury Department would have broad discretion over who receives that money. There is little precedent for a program with a similar size and scope. And so Tammy Duckworth was interviewed on cable TV, and she was pretty good in just describing how disastrous this proposal was. Take a look.
Well, the package that the Republicans have drawn up does nothing to help struggling workers. You know, our struggling workers need help today, and they need their jobs safeguarded for tomorrow. It has no protections for them, you know, and instead it creates a $500 billion slush fund for Steve Mnuchin to, hand out loans to corporations as he please. I mean, do Americans think that this man is going to look out for the well-being of working Americans over the well-being of corporations and corporate CEOs? I certainly don't trust him, not without oversight. And the slush fund that they proposed in their bill, which no Democrat had any chance to put any, requirements into, does not provide any oversights for him. This bill is all skewed towards corporations. It's skewed towards a slush fund that Steve Mnuchin is going to be able to write checks to whoever he wants with no oversight, even to Trump organizations.
On one hand, this has turned into a messaging war because Republicans are always going to beat Democrats in messaging. And what they're saying is, hey, look at Democrats. They don't want to help the average American out. They blocked our attempts to provide relief. But Democrats need to be better. And I think Tammy Duckworth did a great job there, but they need to be better in demonstrating and showing how no, these Senate Republicans are not looking out for you. They're looking out. They want to continue redistributing wealth from the bottom to the top.
If only we had objective, something like a referee that could say, hey, this person is right and that person is wrong, or this party is right and that person is wrong. Maybe we could even call them reporters or right. Journalists, and then they could tell us.
Right.
So the reality is that's what the job of a journalist is supposed to be. So here, let's do it, since the mainstream media is scared to death of Republicans. So anyone who watches the Young Turks knows we got no problem calling out Senate Democrats. We borderline enjoy it. Okay. And we hold them accountable just as much as we hold Senate Republicans accountable. In this case, there is a couple of things that are very, very clear. Number one, yes, they're both trying to pass a stimulus bill. There isn't either side going, I don't really want to pass it. No, even the Republicans, yes, they want to pass it because they're in charge. They're going to get blamed if the economy goes south. If you have massive unemployment, the stock market is crashing. So the Republicans who complained about stimulus bills when Obama was in charge are like, we need a stimulus bill. And we need to be 3 times larger than the one that we gave Obama. So you can call them hypocrites on that, but they certainly do want to pass it. So the Democrats, they want to pass it. Absolutely. There's no question that they want to pass it. They got to get those workers help, but they also need to, let's keep it real, get their donors help. They have the same corporate donors as the Republicans, and they're all in a panic. They are all the Senate Democrats are also rich. They also have money in the stock market. So everybody's motivated to get a bill done. So then the next layer is who is right about the different provisions. In this case, it's definitely the Democrats. So is there a slush fund? Indisputably. I read the bill myself. There's no question it's a slush fund. The Treasury can give it to anyone they like. If they want, they can take the $500 billion and give 400 of it to Mar-a-Lago. There is no checks and balances. Later, when that's abused, people say, "Oh, can you believe they abused that?" Yes, that's why they're objecting now, because we know they're going to abuse it. We can believe it. There's no question about it. But that's not the only issue. There's so many other issues, but the second major one, which is so important, I need people to understand this, is, look, a ton of people are about to get laid off. That is not some sort of Republican trick. That's definitely true, okay? So we've got to try to find a way to protect those folks. So the Republican proposal to do that is give a blank check to the companies, and first to the largest companies, and eventually we'll figure out how to get to the small businesses, right? But they do have provisions for small businesses in here as well, but it's going to take longer to get to us, God help us, right? But for the larger companies, let's just give them a blank check. And the Democrats, led by Elizabeth Warren in this case, are saying, no, wait a minute. If you're going to take that check, you're not allowed to use it to buy back your own stock, just to enrich your executives, and you've got to actually keep your employees. Now, if you care about the average American worker, that is very, very logical. If you do not have that protection, the executives can do whatever they want with the money. And then don't complain later, because there'll be no checks on the CEOs and no checks on the executive branch. So in this case, the Senate Democrats are definitely right to hold it up to have better protections for the average American in this bill.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I agree with the decisions that they made and the fact that they decided to block this legislation on a procedural vote. One other thing to mention is, even though Senate Republicans eventually did concede to Democrats when it came to the corporate stock buybacks, there still weren't protections in place to ensure that companies that took this bailout money would not then go around firing their employees. So since those protections weren't there, clearly Democrats had an issue with it. But one other thing I wanted to quickly mention is that Republicans are playing all sorts of games by trying to get other parts of their legislative agenda included in the stimulus bill. So, for instance, one of the tricks they tried to play was include a provision that would shut down abortion clinics while the coronavirus pandemic continues and while people are forced to stay at home. And so Democrats are like, no, that's not an elective surgery. Time is of the essence if someone needs to have an abortion. So we're not playing ball with that. We're not playing games with that. But Republicans are trying to include all sorts of nonsense provisions. And that is exactly what's holding things back. That's the reason why they're not having any breakthrough with this legislation. And then look, if you think, oh, well, TYT, they come from like a left perspective, let's go to conservative Democrat Joe Manchin, who even spoke out against this legislation. Take a look.
The proposal that Leader McConnell from the Republican side has put forth is absolutely, totally worried about Wall Street at this time. I'm worried about the people in little rural West Virginia and all over Main Street. That's the people we're worried about. Let's make sure that our workers and these healthcare providers don't go down, because if that system goes down, I can assure you, you can't print enough money for Wall Street to rebound if the healthcare system in this country is not able to take care of the people of America.
So Manchin brings up printing money there, and what he's referring to is some of the efforts by the Federal Reserve to save the stock markets. Nothing that they've done has worked so far because they've exhausted everything. I mean, they've lowered interest rates to near zero. They keep buying treasury bonds. Like, they're doing everything they can, and it's not working. And so we're dealing with a real crisis here. You're right, Cenk. A lot of people have already been laid off. The head of the Federal Reserve in St. Louis was just interviewed, and he says that he believes that the unemployment rate will eventually reach 30%, which surpasses what the unemployment rate was during the Great Depression. And, in the meantime, we have these Senate Republicans playing games with their bailouts for these companies, but also by including all these provisions that don't need to be included, that are needlessly drawing out this process much longer than it needs to.
So let me just clarify a couple of things that are important, because this story is complicated. So first off, they do need to make sure that the banks don't call in the loans that businesses have, right? So if a giant corporation has a big loan out and they now have their business dried up, whether it's a restaurant chain, even a car company, et cetera, if the bank calls in the loan, that's it. They're screwed and they're out of business. So the Fed addressing that is important and relevant, okay? And then in terms of all of the businesses, there will almost certainly be layoffs. There already are layoffs, and there will continue to be more layoffs. And even if they get money to the big size business and the small size businesses, there will still need to be some layoffs because revenue is so down for everyone. And just giving money to address the issue of employees still leaves about 40% of an average business's cost unaddressed. So there are no simple answers where we can plug and play. That's why these negotiations are taking longer, because they've got to say, okay, look, we've got to cover, Democrats are saying we've got to cover the employees. Great, that's super important because there's a lot of bad guy companies. You give them the money, they're just going to take it and give it to the executives and fire people anyway. But you also got to address all the companies, including the good companies, who are saying, look, if we don't get the money in now, we're screwed. And we got to lay off more and then more and then more people to try to stay in business. Otherwise, or go out of business. So all those things need to be addressed as quickly as possible and in a rational manner. And when it comes to Washington, we've got a couple of different problems. Number one, there aren't a lot of rational folks there. Number two, more importantly, they all have different interests. So, and their interests vary greatly from us. We care about workers, which then affects companies, which then affects the economy. And that's a rational way of looking at it. And it affects the citizens, because that's the bottom line here, the most amount of people. But remember, especially for the Republican senators, their number one concern by a landslide is, how is this affecting my donors?
Right.
I'll get to the employees later. I'll get to all the other complicated factors later. But my donors just lost 30% of their money in the last week. They're not going to have enough money to give to me. I literally talked to somebody in Washington today who said one of the top concerns for politicians in Washington right now is, damn it, how am I going to raise money for my reelection?
It's amazing. It's amazing. And I mean, you see it in the numbers, Cenk, because they want to appropriate $500 billion toward these bailouts. But when it comes to the stimulus checks for average Americans, they only want to appropriate half that amount, $250 billion. So, I mean, you see it in the numbers, you see it in what they're willing to hold back relief for. And it's devastating, because if you have lawmakers represent the best interests of their donors as opposed to the best interests of everyone they're representing, well, then you're not going to get good representation. You're going to get representation for the wealthy. And that's what we're dealing with right now.
So last two things here in this case, I think, or a couple of things. I think that they will come to an agreement because they have to. It'll probably be tomorrow. I hope that the Republicans don't strong arm the Democrats too much. I'm actually surprised the Democrats have lasted this long. The reason the Republicans are going with this strategy is because usually when they strong arm the Democrats and yell at them, it works. And the reporters just call it even no matter how heinous the Republicans act. And they know that they have that built-in advantage. But I'm pleasantly surprised that the Senate Democrats have held strong. I hope that the Republicans find a way to get to sanity tomorrow. And I know it's a funny thing. I fear completing that sentence. I think they will, and only because they're afraid that the stock market is going to dip more, their donors are going to have less money, and they're not going to be able to have money to run their re-elections. But of all the proposals, I think that Sarah Nelson's is probably the best one. She's the head of the Flight Attendants Union, talked with Bernie Sanders on his stream when he was discussing the coronavirus situation a couple of days ago. And she said, in essence, if companies have to furlough employees, which the airlines have already begun to do, and that is an absolute necessity for almost all companies, then the government should say, we are going to pay the salaries of those furloughed employees. That is, of all the different proposals, it's not, in and of itself, it won't fix everything, but it is an essential component of what we need. both for the companies and for the average American worker. And finally, guys, from our perspective, that's why I started the show with tyt.com/go. This pandemic and the economic crash related to it is no joke. So most of you out there are having your own troubles. Please, if you are, be smart and considerate and reserve your money for what you need and what your family needs. Okay. But if you can, this is the time to help companies that you believe in. And that's why we do things like tyt.com/go, so that we could do as well as we can for everyone here and keep this thing up and running.